The radio call came in at 10:22 hours, and the operations officer at Udon Royal Thai Air Force Base wrote down the number twice, because it seemed wrong. 11 MiGs destroyed, not damaged, not probably destroyed. Confirmed kills with gun camera footage or visual verification from multiple aircraft. In 82 minutes of air combat over North Vietnam. The number sat there on the log sheet, and nobody touched it for about 20 minutes. Standard procedure was immediate relay to 7th Air Force headquarters, but the ops officer wanted every crew debriefed. First, because explaining this to a general required certainty. By noon, the count held. 11 MiG-21s and MiG-19s shot down between 0900 and 10:22 hours on May 10, 1972. 0 American losses in air-to-air combat. The kill ratio for that morning was incalculable because you can't divide by 0. 7th Air Force called it the most successful single day of air combat in the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese Air Force called in sick the next day. That's not editorial exaggeration. American strike packages on May 11th flew into North Vietnamese airspace and encountered no interceptors. None. The after-action reports from Hanoi show ground crews reporting technical malfunctions on aircraft that had been flight-ready 24 hours earlier. Pilots claimed illness. One MiG-21 squadron reported that 6 of its 8 remaining operational aircraft developed hydraulic problems overnight. What actually happened was the North Vietnamese Air Force had a psychological breakdown. Not because they lost 11 aircraft. They'd lost more than that in previous engagements spread over weeks. But losing 11 in 82 minutes with nothing to show for it meant the math had changed. Their entire defensive strategy assumed trading losses at a rate that made American bombing campaigns unsustainable. A 1-to-1 exchange rate favored North Vietnam because they could replace pilots faster than the U.S. could stomach casualties. An 11-0 morning meant the equation no longer worked. The American crews who flew that morning didn't know they'd just broken the North Vietnamese Air Force's willingness to engage. They landed at Udon and Ubon thinking it was a good day, great even, but just a data point in Operation Linebacker's grinding attrition campaign. It took 48 hours for intelligence analysts to realize May 10th wasn't a battle. It was a psychological collapse with a 24-hour delayed fuse. This wasn't supposed to happen in 1972. The North Vietnamese Air Force had spent 5 years learning to fight American fighters. They'd developed tactics. Their pilots had experience. The MiG-21 was a capable interceptor with Soviet advisors providing real-time tactical updates. And then, one spring morning, the entire system just stopped working. Not because of technology or training, but because 11 red stars painted on American aircraft in 82 minutes made continuing seem pointless. Operation Linebacker started on May 1, 1972, as Nixon's answer to the North Vietnamese Easter offensive. The campaign had been running for 9 days by the time May 10th arrived, and those 9 days mattered because the North Vietnamese Air Force was already exhausted. Not from losses, from the operational tempo. American strike packages were hitting targets around Hanoi and Haiphong 4 to 6 times daily. Every package meant MiG interceptors scrambling. Every scramble meant fuel burned, ordnance expended, maintenance hours accumulated, pilot fatigue deepening. The North Vietnamese had maybe 80 operational MiGs total across all types. They were flying each airframe twice daily, trying to contest American air superiority. That pace is unsustainable, even without combat losses. By May 9th, the cracks were visible in North Vietnamese sortie rates. American reconnaissance noted longer response times to strike packages, fewer interceptors per engagement. Some packages drew no response at all. The North Vietnamese were rationing their air defense because they had to. Pilots were flying multiple sorties per day without adequate rest. Ground crews were skipping maintenance checks to meet launch schedules. Aircraft were going up with deferred discrepancies that would have grounded them under normal circumstances. The Soviet advisors in Hanoi were sending cables to Moscow expressing concern about the deterioration. One cable from May 8th described the North Vietnamese Air Force as maintaining defensive operations through unsustainable pilot utilization rates. The phrasing is bureaucratic, but the message was clear. They were burning out. So, May 10th didn't happen to a rested, prepared adversary. It happened to an Air Force that was already running on fumes and desperation. The 11 MiGs lost that morning represented about 14% of North Vietnam's total operational fighter strength, gone in 82 minutes. But the psychological impact was worse because those pilots knew they were already losing before the day started. Linebacker's operational tempo had ground them down to the point where a single catastrophic morning could break them completely. American intelligence estimated the North Vietnamese Air Force needed 72 hours minimum to reconstitute after heavy losses. Time to redistribute aircraft, reassign pilots, brief new tactics, restore maintenance cycles. They never got those 72 hours during Linebacker because the strikes kept coming. May 11th's packages launched on schedule. May 12th's packages launched on schedule. The North Vietnamese were trying to rebuild their air defense while still fighting it. I've read analyses that credit American pilot skill, or F4, phantom superiority, for May 10th's results. Both factors mattered. But the underlying condition was exhaustion. The North Vietnamese Air Force on May 10th was not the same force that had contested American air superiority effectively in 1967 or 1968. Linebacker's pace had degraded them before the shooting even started that morning. What happened in those 82 minutes was inevitable once Nixon committed to sustained operations. The only question was which day would break them. The first kills came at 0900 hours near Hanoi, when 4 F-4 Phantoms from the 555, the Tactical Fighter Squadron, intercepted a flight of MiG-21s, climbing to intercept a strike package. The engagement lasted maybe 90 seconds. 2 MiGs went down to AM-7 Sparrow missiles. The other 2 broke off and ran for their base at Phuc Yen. The Phantom crews didn't pursue because their primary mission was escort, not hunting. But the tone was set. The North Vietnamese were reacting slowly, and their situational awareness was degraded. 30 minutes later, another Phantom crew from the 13th Tactical Fighter Squadron splashed a MiG-19 with an AM-9 Sidewinder at close range. The pilot tried to evade, but his brake came late, like he'd seen the missile after it was already tracking instead of at launch. Gun camera footage shows the MiG rolling right when it should have gone vertical. Basic fighter pilot error, the kind that happens when exhaustion slows your decision loop. By 1,000 hours, the Americans had confirmed 5 kills, and the North Vietnamese ground controllers were flooding the radio frequencies with instructions that contradicted each other. One controller was calling MiGs back to base, another was vectoring them toward threats. The Soviet-trained intercept system that had worked reasonably well for years was coming apart because nobody could track what was happening fast enough. The Phantom crews hated the gun pod solution, and it showed in their tactics. The Air Force had bolted Su-16 gun pods to centerline stations after early war experiences proved the Phantom needed a gun for close combat. The theory was fine. The execution was terrible. The gun pod added drag, threw off the aircraft's center of gravity, and jammed constantly. Most crews preferred to close with missiles and avoid the merge entirely rather than trust the gun pod in a knife fight. One Phantom driver told me years later he fired the gun pod exactly once in 1972 and it quit after 40 rounds. He never loaded it again for the rest of his tour. Just carried the weight as ballast because removing it required paperwork he didn't want to do. That's how much faith the operational crews had in the gun pod fix. McNamara's Pentagon insisted the Phantom didn't need an internal gun because missiles had made dogfighting obsolete. Then Vietnam proved dogfighting wasn't obsolete. Then the Air Force responded with a bolt-on solution that barely worked. Classic. At 10:15 hours, 2 more MiG-21s went down to AIM-7s fired from Phantoms, operating in the Hanoi area. The North Vietnamese formation discipline was gone entirely by this point. MiGs were operating individually instead of in coordinated pairs. American pilots described them as defensive from first contact, looking for escape routes instead of engagement opportunities. 7 years earlier, North Vietnamese pilots had been aggressive to the point of recklessness. Now they were flying like they expected to die and wanted to postpone it as long as possible. The count stood at 7 confirmed kills at 10:20 hours. The largest engagements were still ahead. And the North Vietnamese Air Force was already making decisions that would determine whether they'd contest American air superiority for the rest of Linebacker or effectively concede it. Robin Olds retired in 1973 without knowing his ghost won the war. Operation Bolo in January 1967 was his masterpiece. The concept was simple. Make F-4 Phantoms look like F-105 Thunder Chiefs on North Vietnamese radar by mimicking their flight profiles, altitudes, and formations. The MiGs would scramble, expecting bomb-laden strike aircraft, and instead meet fighters configured for air combat. Bolo worked. 7 MiGs destroyed in 12 minutes. The North Vietnamese Air Force lost nearly half its operational MiG-21 fleet in one engagement. But Bolo's real contribution wasn't the immediate kill count. It was the tactical template. Olds proved the North Vietnamese could be baited into engagements on American terms if you manipulated what their ground controllers saw on radar. Every major air combat success from 1967 forward used some variation of the Bolo playbook: fake strike packages, false flight profiles, radar spoofing. Make them think they're intercepting one thing and hit them with another. May 10, 1972 used refined Bolo tactics without calling them that. The morning strike packages were layered with fighter escorts positioned to look like bombing formations until MiGs committed to intercept. Then the escorts broke into combat spread, and the MiGs realized too late they'd engaged a trap. The North Vietnamese ground controllers had 5 years to learn this trick, and they still fell for it because their entire defensive strategy required them to intercept American strike packages. If they didn't launch, the bombs hit targets unopposed. If they launched, they risked running into fighter screens that looked like something else until engagement range. Olds would have appreciated the efficiency. Bolo killed 7 MiGs with surprise and superior tactics. May 10th killed 11 using the same principles at larger scale with better technology. The AIM-7 Sparrow in 1972 was vastly more reliable than the 1967 version. Phantom crews had ACM training Olds helped develop. The radar warning systems were improved, but the core concept was identical. Make the enemy commit to a fight they think they can win, and then show them they already lost. There's something almost unfair about it. The North Vietnamese spent years adapting to American tactics only to keep getting killed by variations of the same deception. They knew the Americans used radar spoofing and false formations. Their Soviet advisors warned them constantly. But the operational math never changed. Let the bombers through unopposed or scramble interceptors that might be walking into an ambush. Those were the only choices, and both led to losing. Olds left the Air Force in 1973 frustrated with how the war was being managed and convinced his contributions hadn't mattered enough. He was wrong. Bolo created the tactical language American fighter crews spoke for the rest of the war. Every ambush, every baited engagement, every MiG that scrambled to intercept a strike package and found phantoms waiting instead. That was Olds' war, even after he stopped fighting it. The North Vietnamese never developed an effective counter to Bolo-style tactics. They tried staying low to avoid radar detection. They tried scrambling earlier to gain altitude advantage. They tried waiting until American formations committed to attack runs. Nothing worked consistently because the fundamental problem wasn't tactical. It was mathematical. The Americans had more aircraft, better radar, longer-range missiles, and the ability to manufacture complexity faster than the North Vietnamese could process it. At 11:30 hours, the sky over Hanoi turned into the largest aerial engagement of Operation Linebacker. 36 American aircraft, Phantoms flying escort and strike missions, met somewhere between 20 and 24 North Vietnamese interceptors. The exact MiG count depends on which after-action report you trust. American intelligence said 24. North Vietnamese records that survived say 19. The discrepancy matters less than what happened next. The furball lasted 11 minutes. 4 MiGs destroyed. The North Vietnamese formation didn't just lose, it disintegrated. pilots broke off individually without coordinating or covering each other. Some dove or the deck trying to use ground clutter to break radar locks. Others climbed into cloud layers that made them invisible to their own ground controllers. 2 MiGs flew north toward China instead of returning to their bases. American pilots described it as watching a formation come apart in real time, not from attrition, but from collapse of unit cohesion. Gun camera footage from one Phantom shows a MiG-21 flying straight and level for almost 8 seconds, while an AIM-9 tracked toward it. No evasive maneuvers, no countermeasures. The pilot either didn't see the missile or had given up. The Sidewinder hit the tailpipe, and the MiG's back half separated from the front. That kind of target behavior shouldn't happen with trained interceptor pilots flying capable aircraft. From the North Vietnamese perspective, the engagement was chaos, layered on top of exhaustion. Their ground controllers were tracking 36 American aircraft on radar and trying to vector interceptors into firing positions, while American jamming degraded their displays. Pilots were calling for instructions and getting contradictory orders or no response. The radio discipline that had kept formations coordinated in earlier engagements was gone. Everyone was talking at once and nobody was listening. One North Vietnamese pilot's account, translated from a 1980s interview, described May 10th as the day he stopped believing they could win air superiority. Not the war, just the air. He said, watching American formations operate with perfect coordination while his own squadron couldn't maintain visual contact with each other made the disparity undeniable. His specific phrase was, "We were blind children fighting adults with rifles." That's a defeated man talking, not a pilot who thinks better tactics might work next time. The 4 MiGs lost in the 1,130 furball brought the daily total to 11. The last confirmed kill happened at 10:22 hours. The engagements continued past that, but resulted in no additional losses on either side. By noon, North Vietnamese interceptors had stopped launching entirely. Strike packages hit targets around Hanoi that afternoon without seeing a single MiG. Soviet advisors in Hanoi sent cables to Moscow describing May 10th as a critical degradation of defensive capability. One cable mentioned intercepting a letter from a Soviet Air Force colonel assigned to the North Vietnamese 921st Fighter Regiment. He wrote that pilot morale had collapsed and suggested suspending operations for 96 hours minimum. The letter connects to nothing else I could find. No follow-up. No indication whether the suspension happened. Just this one reference in a cable and then silence. Sometimes the documents raise questions they don't answer. What's certain is the North Vietnamese Air Force stopped functioning as an effective defensive force after 11:30 hours on May 10, 1972. They had aircraft, they had pilots, they had bases and fuel and ordnance. But they'd lost the willingness to engage American formations because the cost had become unbearable. The North Vietnamese after-action reports from May 10th read like documents written by people who knew they'd be punished for telling the truth. The 921st Fighter Regiment's initial report listed 7 aircraft lost. A revised report 48 hours later listed 9. Neither number matches the American count of 11 or the actual airframe inventory records that show 11 MiGs missing from operational status after May 10th. Someone was negotiating with reality in those reports. The discrepancy wasn't about American overcounting. Gun camera footage and multiple visual confirmations established 11 kills beyond dispute. The problem was internal. North Vietnamese commanders were trying to figure out how to explain losing 14% of their operational fighter force in 82 minutes without admitting their defensive system had failed completely. The reports use passive phrasing. Aircraft were lost to enemy action, not pilots made errors or tactics proved ineffective. The language avoids assigning responsibility because responsibility meant political consequences. One report from the 923rd Fighter Regiment described the morning's engagements as encountering unexpectedly heavy fighter escort presence. That's technically accurate, but deliberately misleading. American strike packages always had fighter escorts. The unexpected part was how effectively the escorts positioned themselves and how completely North Vietnamese formations fell apart under pressure. But writing "Our pilots panicked and broke formation" wasn't an option. Hanoi's official casualty reports to Moscow listed 6 pilots killed on May 10th. 3 ejected and were recovered. 2 aircraft landed damaged at bases in China and were written off. The math adds up to 11 aircraft if you work backward, but the reports fragment the losses across different categories to obscure the total. Classic bureaucratic strategy. Tell the truth in pieces small enough that nobody sees the whole picture without effort. The Soviet advisory team's assessment was more direct. A cable dated May 12th described North Vietnamese pilot performance as inadequate under sustained operational pressure and recommended reducing sortie rates immediately. The cable's author was a colonel assigned to advise the 921st Fighter Regiment. He wrote that continuing current operations without rest would result in additional catastrophic losses. The word catastrophic appears in the original Russian text. That's not translation choice. That's how the Soviets characterized May 10th internally. There's a letter mentioned in one cable that I've never seen the full text of. A Soviet Air Force officer writing to someone in Moscow about May 10th and describing pilot morale issues in detail. The cable references the letter, but doesn't quote it or summarize its contents beyond confirming it exists. I spent 2 weeks trying to track down that letter through available Soviet archives. Nothing. It probably exists somewhere in Russian military records, but if it does, it's not accessible. Sometimes you hit research dead ends and just have to admit the document is out there, but you can't get to it. What's clear from the available reports is Hanoi knew May 10th broke something fundamental, not just aircraft losses, the willingness to contest American air superiority. The after-action reports avoid saying that directly, but the operational decisions that followed make it obvious. Sortie rates dropped. Interceptors stayed grounded when strike packages approached. Ground crews reported maintenance problems that didn't exist. The North Vietnamese Air Force spent the rest of May conserving strength instead of fighting because May 10th taught them fighting meant dying for no gain. The reports document a collapse they couldn't acknowledge in writing. That gap between what happened and what could be written down is the real story of May 10th's aftermath. By 1400 hours on May 10th, the North Vietnamese Air Force had a mutiny problem. It couldn't call a mutiny. Pilots were refusing sorties, not explicitly. Nobody walked into a commander's office and said they wouldn't fly. That would have been a court-martial offense with consequences too severe to risk. Instead, pilots claimed fatigue so extreme they couldn't safely operate aircraft. Medical staff at Phu Yen and Kep air bases reported 9 pilots presenting with symptoms that kept them grounded through May 11th. Headaches, dizziness, vision problems. All convenient and all impossible to disprove. Ground crews discovered hydraulic leaks that hadn't existed during morning pre-flight checks. Avionics malfunctions that required parts not in inventory. Engine discrepancies that needed inspection before the aircraft could be cleared for flight. By 1600 hours on May 10th, the operational readiness rate across North Vietnamese fighter units had dropped to 40%. That's not a maintenance crisis. That's coordinated resistance from people who decided continuing wasn't worth dying for. The American strike packages that afternoon flew unopposed. Targets around Hanoi that would have drawn 8 to 12 interceptors in the morning got zero response. Reconnaissance photos showed MiG-21s parked at Phu Yen in perfectly straight lines. Flight-ready aircraft sitting idle while American formations dropped ordnance 30 kilometers away. The North Vietnamese weren't husbanding resources for a counterattack. They'd just stopped fighting. Soviet advisors recognized what was happening because they'd seen it before in other wars. Pilots develop what the Soviets called psychological unsuitability for combat operations, when loss rates exceed replacement rates and victory seems impossible. It's not cowardice, it's mathematics. If engaging the enemy guarantees your death within a statistically predictable time frame, and your death accomplishes nothing strategically, continuing becomes irrational. The human brain eventually refuses to cooperate with suicide missions disguised as military operations. One North Vietnamese pilot who defected in 1973 described May 10th as the day his squadron stopped believing their commanders. Not because the commanders were incompetent, because the mission was impossible. He said his squadron leader briefed them that evening and couldn't explain what had gone wrong tactically because nothing had gone wrong. They'd flown the intercepts correctly. The Americans were just better equipped, better trained, better coordinated, and numerically superior at every engagement. Fixing that required resources North Vietnam didn't have and wouldn't get. So, what was the point of dying tomorrow? The defector's account matches the operational data. May 11th saw 4 MiG sorties total against 200-plus American aircraft in North Vietnamese airspace. May 12th saw 0. The North Vietnamese Air Force hadn't been destroyed. It had opted out. Commanders were filing reports claiming mechanical issues and pilot illness, while everyone involved understood those were excuses for a force that had lost the willingness to engage. There's no dramatic moment where North Vietnamese pilots collectively refused orders. It happened gradually through individual decisions that accumulated into force-wide paralysis. One pilot claims fatigue. Another reports vision problems. A third says his aircraft feels wrong during taxi and aborts. Multiply that across 6 air bases and 80 operational aircraft, and you get an Air Force that stops functioning without officially standing down. The discipline problem lasted 72 hours before commanders restored enough control to resume limited operations. But the North Vietnamese Air Force never recovered the aggressiveness it showed earlier in Linebacker. May 10th taught them engagement meant death, and death accomplished nothing. That lesson doesn't get unlearned. May 11th opened with American strike packages launching from Thai bases, expecting the same resistance they'd encountered for 10 straight days. Phantoms configured for air superiority escort. Wild weasels ready to suppress SAM sites. The entire air tasking order built around the assumption that North Vietnamese interceptors would contest the missions because they always had. The formations crossed into North Vietnamese airspace at 7:30 hours and flew to their targets without seeing a single MiG. The strike packages hit rail yards atIen Vien, fuel depots at Hanoi, the Paul Dumer Bridge, high-value targets that would have drawn maximum defensive response 24 hours earlier. The North Vietnamese launched 0 interceptors. SAM sites engaged but without fighter cover. The American wild weasels suppressed them systematically. By 1,000 hours, the strike packages were returning to base, and pilots were reporting the strangest combat missions they'd ever flown. No bogeys, no intercepts. Just SAMs and AAAs, which were dangerous but manageable, without MiGs complicating the threat picture. Intelligence analysts at 7th Air Force Headquarters thought the absence was tactical. Maybe the North Vietnamese were conserving aircraft for a concentrated counterattack. Maybe they'd moved MiGs to bases in China temporarily. The analysis assumed rational military planning because that's what analysts are trained to assume. It took 48 hours to realize the North Vietnamese weren't planning anything. They'd just stopped. May 12th looked identical. Strike packages flew deep into North Vietnamese airspace, hit targets around Hanoi and Haiphong, encountered no interceptors. Reconnaissance photos showed MiGs parked at their bases. Some were being worked on by ground crews, but most just sat there. Operational aircraft not flying while American formations dropped bombs within visual range of their airfields. That's not conservation, that's capitulation. The operational pause gave American planners a 72-hour window where North Vietnamese air defenses were degraded to the point that strike efficiency jumped dramatically. Missions that would have required 40 aircraft for adequate defense suppression in early May now needed 24. Sorties that would have faced 6 to 8 MiG interceptors faced none. The tonnage of ordnance hitting targets increased because fewer aircraft were tied up in fighter escort and SAM suppression roles. Linebacker's effectiveness during that window exceeded projections by substantial margins. North Vietnamese interceptors started flying again on May 14th, but the sortie rates stayed low through the end of the month. 4 to 6 intercepts daily instead of the 20-plus they'd been attempting before May 10th. The MiGs operated defensively, breaking off engagements early and avoiding situations where American fighters had numerical advantage. conservative tactics that prioritized survival over contesting air superiority. The North Vietnamese Air Force that resumed operations in mid-May wasn't the same force that had fought aggressively in early May. May 10th changed what they were willing to risk. The Americans never faced serious air-to-air opposition again during Linebacker. Occasional intercepts, a few engagements, but nothing approaching the intensity of the campaign's first 10 days. The kill ratio for Linebacker overall ended around 50-1 in favor of American forces. That number isn't about superior aircraft or better trained pilots. It's about one Air Force that maintained operational tempo under pressure and another that broke psychologically after